Smiles and laughter fill the streets as wealthy families take part in the festivities, drinking overpriced hot chocolate while paving our roads with their trash, empty cartoons, and candy wrappers. My parents owned a small shop right in the heart of town, with the Christmas tree shining its marvelous glow through our store windows, giving us a glimpse into the spectacle of what tourists experienced when coming here. As one might have guessed, we were no different from the other town folk. We were not that well off, and I spent my winter breaks helping out at our store during the busy season. Here is where I got to see all the other children from out of town smiling with wonderment as their parents gifted them with almost every present they could ask for. I honestly grew to despise these families, seeing how gleeful they were while we struggled to keep the lights on. My father was always looking for quick, get-rich schemes, convinced that all he had to do was find the right scam. Because of this, he wasted away our entire life savings by the time I was 10. So our entire family's income depended on our little candle store that was left to my mother by her parents. It wasn't much, and throughout the year most of the town wouldn't spend a dime on luxuries such as scented candles. But during the holiday season, out-of-towners would come in droves, all too excited to buy their little piece of our country life. To be honest, I hated it. The stench of candy cane and cinnamon plagued my nostrils for months after the season was over, and all I ever dreamt of was for our candles to melt away like some horrid scene you would see in some scary movie. The amber flames slowly pecking away at the wax like some woodpecker demolishing a tree. By the time I was in middle school, I pleaded with my parents to not force me to work in the store. I was tired of all the out-of-town kids looking down on me. Their judgmental stares and snickering had me on the edge. But I think even worse, I was tired of having a front-row view of that obnoxious, oversized tree. Well, it wasn't so much the tree itself. It was more of what was in front of it, an empty golden chair with red velvet cushions. It was Santa's chair. As long as I can remember, our tradition of having Santa visit the town center was always the same. The week before Christmas, the jolly old man would arrive and sit at his throne, inviting all the eager kids into his lap, each one filled with hopes of having their ideal present gifted to them on Christmas morning. When I was 7 years old, my parents stood me in line to meet the man who epitomized the jovial holiday. I remember being bewildered at how long the wait was. I could see all the other kids smiling and reveling in the premise of meeting the old man, all thinking that asking him for some gift would magically assure them of their dream. For my age, I knew I wasn't like the other kids. Most of them that stood in line weren't from my town. I knew asking some stranger for some gift was just as foolish as wishing for something when blowing out your birthday candles. Though my parents thought the whole event would make me happy, or maybe they just needed time for themselves, either way they left me in line as they drifted away to finish some Christmas shopping, all while the adults dressed like elves kept a close eye on me. For whatever reason, I felt the strange sensation of trepidation slowly creeping its way into my small mind. The longer I waited, the more that feeling of dread only grew. I think it was the permeating sound of that laughter, Santa's laughter. The man would belch out with the most agonizing chuckle any time a new kid would sit on his lap. I even covered my ears a few times, trying to block out the abysmal noise. But when I did, the elves would walk over to me and forcefully pull my hands down. Honestly, by the time I was a few kids away, I pondered the idea of just slipping out of line and searching for my parents. As soon as I worked up the courage to do so, it was my turn. One of the elves picked me up with a bit of despondency, but their actions quickly turned into one of urgency, rushing me over, then plopping me down on the old man's lap, his I had everything a man could ask for: a wife, a son, a roof over my head, a good-paying job, and even my health. But I took it all for granted. "Aw, come on, Dad. Just one more game." My 10-year-old son called out as he sat in front of the console, controller in hand, waving me back to the living room. "Hey, you lost. Fair and square. Mister, there's always tomorrow." "But I want to play tonight. Tonight's Christmas Eve, bud. There is no time for games. Your mom's got a packed agenda for us." "Bah humbug, Dad. It sounds like you want coal in your stocking." I threw on my jacket and a pair of boots as I walked over to the sliding door that led to our backyard. "Mom's got what?" I heard my wife ask from the kitchen before running over to see me out. "Little Scrooge over there would rather play video games than decorate the tree with us." I said it with a wink. "You'd think it was the kid's first Christmas." She laughed before planting a big kiss on my cheek and asking, "Do me a favor." Yeah, I replied, knowing exactly what she was getting at. "Downsize the tree this year." "Downsize the tree is right. And you remember why?" "'Cause last year I got a little too ambitious, and it didn't fit in the house." I got it. That was funny. My son yelled out from the other room. My wife simply rolled her eyes. "And be quick about it. I'm about to make hot cocoa." "In that case, I better get to it," I replied with a cheeky smile before stepping outside into the snow. As I slammed the door behind me, and I pulled an axe from a stack of logs behind the house, taking it with me. Nearly a foot of snow had accumulated the night before, and from the way it was falling now, it didn't seem to be letting up anytime soon. And so, I set off on my journey, trudging my way through my backyard and into the forest, seeking to find the perfect tree for our Christmas Eve festivities. It must have been about 5 or 10 minutes before I finally found it, standing there in all its coniferous glory, about 8 feet in height. Picking up my axe, I cut a hinge on one side of the tree's trunk and then began to chop away at the other until I heard a great cracking sound and it tumbled over. I then took the axe and hacked away at what remained of the trunk between the 2 incisions before hauling the heavy thing back through the snow and all the way back to the house before dragging it into the kitchen. "Smells great," I called out, spotting 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate on the table, seemingly untouched. But no one replied. I looked down to find a present, wrapped up with a bow, that had been carefully placed on the table while I was out. "Wow, thank you, guys," I called out louder now, in anticipation of my wife and son hopping out to surprise me. But I was met with silence. I stood up from the table and walked through the house, looking for them, to no avail. I then walked over to the front door and looked out the window at the driveway to find both my wife and my cars still parked. The mother-in-law must have picked them up, I rationalized to myself. Knowing what I know now, had I had the foresight to open the door and look down at the snow, I wouldn't have seen any footprints leading from the house to the car. But I honestly didn't think much of it at the time. As I stepped back into the kitchen, I found a man in a black mask, entirely covering his face, sitting at the table, holding one of the cups of hot cocoa. In front of him was the very same package I'd seen before. It was at this time that I realized that the gift was not from my family, but from him. "Sit down," he commanded ominously. "Who the fuck are you?" I yelled out, startled to the core, as I looked around the room for an object to defend myself with. "Sit down, or you'll never see your family again." I did as he said. "Who are you?" I asked again. "All in due time. Now open the package." I obeyed his command and unwrapped it. It was an unmarked cardboard box. Inside it are a heap of puzzle pieces. The masked man then proceeded to remove a stopwatch from his hand. "This is the first of 5 games. Win them all, and you get to see your family again. Lowe's, and something worse. For the first game, simply build this puzzle in an hour. Hey, what do you?" But before I could say anything, he had already started the timer. Not knowing where this was all going, I just did as he said and sat there in silence, focused on putting the puzzle together before the time was up, as he sat there, watching me. At one point, he lifted his mask just enough to drink from one of the mugs and took a sip of hot cocoa before suggesting I do the same. Please, don't let it go to waste. But I was too focused on completing the puzzle in time and ignored the offer. And sure enough, at around 55 minutes, I finished it. Very good, he said, congratulating me. There were 2 more games that night. First, after directing me to put up the Christmas tree, he challenged me to decorate it with every one of our 100 or so ornaments, a solo task that was intended for 3, without dropping any. Second, handing me 2 old sleds and asking me to carry them, he led me down the street, through the snow, and over to a hill, where he challenged me to beat him in a race to the bottom. This one felt a bit bizarre, but I wasn't in any position to question it and just went along with it, determined to win. When we got back, he told me to change into my pajamas and go to sleep, claiming that I'd need to rest up for the remaining 2 games in the morning. Once again, I did as he asked and tried my best to sleep that night, tossing and turning while the masked man sat there in the corner of the room watching me. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning on Christmas Day, I had nearly forgotten about him, half expecting to be greeted by the sounds of my wife and son opening presents. But instead, all I heard was, "Get up. It's time for the 4th game. Since you went ahead and cut down a tree yesterday without me, it's time to find another." And so he led me outside into the snow. As he slammed the door behind us, and he pulled an axe from a stack of logs behind the house, taking it with him. Nearly 2 feet of snow had now accumulated on the ground, and from the way it continued to fall, it still didn't seem to be letting up anytime soon. And so, we set off on our journey, trudging our way through my backyard and into the forest, seeking to fell another tree. It must have been about 5 or 10 minutes before we finally found the one he was looking for, marked with dozens of wrapped boxes below it, this time 20 feet in height. "This one," he said, pointing to it. "But that's going to take me forever," I replied. "We have all day." "No time limit?" I asked. "Not this time." Just as I had done the day before, I picked up my axe, cut a hinge on one side of the tree's trunk, and then began to chop away at the other. But this time, it wasn't so easy. I stood there, hacking and hacking away at the tree, my arms growing more and more weak by the swing, as the masked man stood there watching, until eventually I heard a great cracking sound, and it tumbled over. I immediately toppled over from exhaustion and dropped the axe. "Oh, you're not done yet." The tree's still attached to the stump. I hobbled back over, picked up the axe, and chopped away at what remained of the trunk between the 2 incisions. I didn't know it at the time, but I would never end up hauling this one through the snow, all the way back to the house, and into the kitchen, like I had the other the day before. No, this tree wasn't meant for the house. "Well done," he said, as I stood there, hunched over, nearly hyperventilating from exhaustion, gripping the axe. I looked down at it, and then over at him. "You know full well that you can't use it on me," he said, noticing me, "or else you'll never see your family again." I relaxed my grip on its handle. "Hand it to me." I handed it to him. And now for the last game, a simple guessing game. I had no idea where this was going. Guess who I am, and I let you go back to your home. Guess wrong, and I cut your leg off and leave you here to die. But I was too concerned with the fate of my wife and child to be affected by the threat. What about my family? Oh, they're tied up in the basement, safe and sound. I was never going to hurt them. You've already hurt one family. "Excuse me?" I asked, confused by the implication. "That's a clue. Now, take your guess." "I don't know. You can't think of anyone in this world who might have reason to make you pay for something you did." "I'm sorry, I just don't know." Last hint. Does this ring a bell? Suddenly, The masked man removed his mask, revealing a face that I had never seen before. He was a nondescript adult male, about 20 or 30 years of age, with a sad look in his eyes. I struggled to think back to anyone in my life that I might have met who resembled the man but couldn't. "I'm sorry, I just don't know. Sadly, I had a feeling you'd say that." He said this, lowering his head before continuing. "But had you never knocked up my mother? Had you never rejected her attempts to contact you? Had you offered up a dime to help her while she and I lived a life of squalor, and you lived a life of luxury, you would recognize me. Your abandoned son, now all grown up, is a complete stranger to you." I was young and stupid. I yelled back, tears falling from my eyes, now remembering what he was referring to, a memory I had recklessly worked so hard to bury away. "Yes, young and stupid. But that doesn't excuse the fact that you left me for dead." He picked up the axe, "just as I'm going to do to you now." And like that, my long-lost son proceeded to hack off my leg, blood spraying across the white forest floor. As I screamed and screamed, no one was around to hear my cries. "Now, before I go," he said as I lay there, that I had nearly passed out from the pain. "Somewhere in one of those packages is a gun. If you scramble for it fast enough that I'm still within shooting distance, I invite you to take a shot. If you find it after I'm gone, I invite you to use it on yourself." He began to walk away before stopping and turning back, as if having forgotten to tell me something. "Oh, and one last thing. I thought that spending all this time with you and playing all these games with you would bring me some sort of joy and fill some sort of void in my heart. But you know what? I felt nothing. Son, don't leave me here. I'm sorry." I pleaded, but he continued to walk away. Dragging myself over to the packages, I began to furiously rummage through them in search of the gun, only to find each one empty. That's when I realized that there likely wasn't any gun at all, a red herring designed to trick me into wasting my precious time, as I bled out in the forest. And so, as I saw my son disappear into the distance, I conjured up every last ounce of strength and crawled my way back through the forest, back through my yard, and back to my home, leaving a long trail of blood behind me. Hobbling into the house, I struggled to prop myself up onto a chair, picked up my cell phone, and called the police, who would later find me passed out in the kitchen, my family tied up in the basement, but alive. And so, now, every year on Christmas Eve, I'm still haunted by my long-lost son, not by what he did to me, but that he was still out there, fatherless. Footsteps, the most natural sound in the world, are something you commonly hear, especially if you don't live alone. Though if you do, and no one is around, those steps are the most terrifying noises one could ever hear. I have been plagued with the most dreadful sounds of footsteps walking towards me since I was a teen. It happens at night, when I'm tucked into bed, feeling the gravity of the world forcing my eyes shut. Footsteps seem to cautiously appear. The sound slowly creeps its way into my mind. Thud, thud, thud. I try my best to not sleep. I wish I could say I suffer from insomnia or some other sleep disorder, but unfortunately I don't. Instead, I drink endless amounts of coffee each night, not wanting to close my eyes. On average, I get about 2 hours of rest, and somehow I've been able to make that work. My friends think I've gone mad, but they don't hear what I hear. Those monstrous steps started off from a distance, slight shuffling like the sounds a kid would make when not wanting to walk forward, just dragging their feet. But eventually the timid steps transitioned into a more profound one with malevolence. The sound usually awakens me sometime in the middle of the night, darkness still shrouding my room in a daze of mystery. As soon as my eyes shoot open, there is nothing. The once bewildering sounds that echoed with such dominance simply vanish. Originally, I didn't think much about it. I told my parents about the footsteps, and they shrugged it off, telling me it was part of my dreams, that sometimes dreams cross over into the real world. I was confused. I didn't know what they meant about the dream world colliding with our own, but I took their words to heart and tried my best not to fear the sound. The closer the ponderous steps would get, I would just remind myself that it was all in my mind, that whoever was making those noises in the dream world couldn't hurt me here. The older I got, the more dreadful the steps became. I would tell myself I was too old to be scared of boogeymen, so I went on about my life to the best I could, not letting imaginary beasts conquer my world. I wouldn't always hear the sounds. Sometimes I would go months without hearing anything, but I noticed the older I got, the more frequent the steps would become. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that the sounds would happen at least once a week, and now they're every night. Thud, thud, thud. I could feel the presence of some ungodly entity approaching me, their lengthy shadow reaching out through the mist of darkness to grab me as I slumbered in the realm of the unconscious. I know what it wants, something I took when I was young. It wasn't supposed to be like this, and all I wish for is for me to take it back. I'm from a small town you probably have never heard of. It's somewhere up north, a land of gray skies and dirt roads, though the small pond we call home blossoms each year around Christmas time. The little town that time forgot transforms from one of despair to beauty, the embodiment of the season. The old withered buildings with cracks become covered with flashing lights of all hues, red, green, and blue. Our abandoned town center is now inundated with wreaths and endless strings of garland, but more astonishing is the wonderment of our Christmas tree, a massive relic that holds the keys to the center of our universe, standing taller than our own town hall. The jovial display of a facade is created for the tourist. Strangers come to our home consuming all the resources only to leave an empty shell once the season is over, and then it would take another year for my city to come back to life with the resurrection of holiday spirit. Smiles and laughter fill the streets as wealthy families take part in the festivities, drinking overpriced hot chocolate while paving our roads with their trash, empty cartoons, and candy wrappers. My parents owned a small shop right in the heart of town, with the Christmas tree shining its marvelous glow through our store windows, giving us a glimpse into the spectacle of what tourists experienced when coming here. As one might have guessed, we were no different from the other town folk. We were not that well off, and I spent my winter breaks helping out at our store during the busy season. Here is where I got to see all the other children from out of town smiling with wonderment as their parents gifted them with almost every present they could ask for. I honestly grew to despise these families, seeing how gleeful they were while we struggled to keep the lights on. My father was always looking for quick, get-rich schemes, convinced that all he had to do was find the right scam. Because of this, he wasted away our entire life savings by the time I was 10. So our entire family's income depended on our little candle store that was left to my mother by her parents. It wasn't much, and throughout the year most of the town wouldn't spend a dime on luxuries such as scented candles, but during the holiday season, out-of-towners would come in droves, all too excited to buy their little piece of our country life. To be honest, I hated it. The stench of candy cane and cinnamon plagued my nostrils for months after the season was over, and all I ever dreamt of was for our candles to melt away like some horrid scene you would see in some scary movie, the amber flames slowly pecking away at the wax like some woodpecker demolishing a tree. By the time I was in middle school, I pleaded with my parents to not force me to work in the store. I was tired of all the out-of-town kids looking down on me. Their judgmental stares and snickering had me on the edge. But I think even worse, I was tired of having a front-row view of that obnoxious, oversized tree. Well, it wasn't so much the tree itself. It was more of what was in front of it. An empty golden chair with red velvet cushions. It was Santa's chair. As long as I can remember, our tradition of having Santa visit the town center was always the same. The week before Christmas, the jolly old man would arrive and sit at his throne, inviting all the eager kids into his lap, each one filled with hopes of having their ideal present gifted to them on Christmas morning. When I was 7 years old, my parents stood me in line to meet the man who epitomized the jovial holiday. I remember being bewildered at how long the wait was. I could see all the other kids smiling and reveling in the premise of meeting the old man, all thinking that asking him for some gift would magically assure them of their dream. For my age, I knew I wasn't like the other kids. Most of them that stood in line weren't from my town. I knew asking some stranger for some gift was just as foolish as wishing for something when blowing out your birthday candles. Though my parents thought the whole event would make me happy, or maybe they just needed time for themselves, either way they left me in line as they drifted away to finish some Christmas shopping, all while the adults dressed like elves kept a close eye on me. For whatever reason, I felt the strange sensation of trepidation slowly creeping its way into my small mind. The longer I waited, the more that feeling of dread only grew. I think it was the permeating sound of that laughter, Santa's laughter. The man would belch out with the most agonizing chuckle any time a new kid would sit on his lap. I even covered my ears a few times, trying to block out the abysmal noise. But when I did, the elves would walk over to me and forcefully pull my hands down. Honestly, by the time I was a few kids away, I pondered the idea of just slipping out of line and searching for my parents. As soon as I worked up the courage to do so, it was my turn. One of the elves picked me up with a bit of despondency, but their actions quickly turned into one of urgency, rushing me over, then plopping me down on the old man's lap. Though my stealthy nature was left to be desired, and it was quite evident to her family that I was available, I tried my best to act as if the blood wasn't rushing to my face. I remember Kimberly's parents asking if I was ill. All I could do was shake my head, reassuring them I was fine. But that's when it happened, when we locked eyes. Kimberly knew I was blushing because of her, and the largest smile formed on her angelic face. I would have floated away in that moment if it weren't for her parents breaking my daydream and asking how much the candle they were purchasing. Each year I would see different versions of Kimberly, her growing into the gracious woman she would eventually be. But behind the different outfits and hairstyles, I could always see her light, shining brighter than any star. I would see her beauty. My attraction wasn't one-sided, and she too was all too excited to see me each year, albeit for mere minutes. Eventually I worked up the courage to get her number, and it didn't take long for us to build a bond. I was beyond thrilled to see her for the holiday, but I knew I needed more time with her. This is why I told my parents I couldn't work in the store, but unfortunately they told me this wasn't an option. Being the good kid I was, I complied and asked Kimberly if she could sneak out of their rental lodge when she and her parents came to town. That's when I would make time for her. She was quite understanding. This idea satisfied her, and we decided to meet at the town center. She wanted to meet by the tree. When the hour struck, I snuck out my back window, my heart racing a million miles, all to indulge in the premise of being able to kiss my crush, something I've dreamed of for years, and if Santa were ever really kissing Kimberly, it would have been at the top of my list of things I wanted for Christmas. The night felt different. The breeze prickled at my skin like small knives cutting deep gashes amongst my cheeks, and the thin air seemed to be vacate my lungs for higher ground. Something was definitely off, and the only thing my teenage mind came up with was the fact I was meeting Kimberly. I told myself that it was just nerves. I've built up this moment for far too long, and now I was psyching myself out. I didn't let my trepidation consume me. Instead, I pressed on with reassurance that Kimberly's soft, pouty lips awaited me on the other end of this dark, foreboding tunnel. When I arrived at the town square, I could see Kimberly's silhouette standing next to the Christmas tree. The monstrosity's oversized shadow encapsulated her in a vague darkness. Our town was quiet. I could hear the rustling of leaves brushing against the pavement and swirls of debris colliding against park benches as the wind randomly guided them across our city. My fear did not subside at this point. In fact, it seemed to only strengthen. Kimberly," I called out nervously. The shadow beneath the tree did nothing. No response or recognition of any type. Perhaps she had headphones on. Maybe she was listening to music as she awaited me. I stepped closer as the thumping of my own heartbeat inundated my hearing. But soon that sound was replaced by one that was unnatural, a mechanical one, but it came almost in a rhythmic pulse, just as my heart. I stopped to get a better listen as I inhaled deeply, trying to ease my breathing. The sound was a bit more vivid. The pulsating noise escalated to a faster pace, becoming more frequent, and after what seemed like minutes, I realized what the odd sound was. It was the sound of bells. "Kimberly." I called out once again, this time with a whimper, as the shaky tone that found its way out of my mouth fell on deaf ears. The shadow that I presumed was Kim still did nothing. It stood there without a glitch. I contemplated in those few seconds if this was all wrong. Those sounds of bells began to approach closer as the strong wind kept swirling around me. I gulped with a heavy sigh and knew I was being silly. There was nothing to be concerned about. I waited for this moment for far too long, and I needed to finally hold Kimberly in my arms. Before I could take another step, my phone chimed, breaking my chilling reflection. I pulled out my flip phone and looked at the message, the words sending pricks of needles down my spine. It was from "Parents were hiding from me in hopes that I would find it by myself." I looked down at the note, and my heart sank. It didn't say it was from Mom or Dad. Instead, it said from Santa. I stared at the handwritten label with disbelief. My parents knew I didn't believe in Santa. Why would they bother with the theatrics? I didn't contemplate the enigma for too long. I was all too eager to see what secrets the mystifying gift would supply. I shook the box a few times, trying to identify any recognizable sound, but heard nothing. The weight alone suggested that only air would be behind the walls of the box. I tore into the gift with wonderment, and for whatever reason, a slight shiver ran across my body. Subtle memories of that dreadful Santa consumed my thoughts, and as I opened the mystery, I saw there was only a sealed envelope. I narrowed my eyes, confounded as to why my parents would put a note inside a box. Either way, I proceeded to open the envelope, anticipating money being enclosed inside, but instead it was a simple note, one that didn't take long to read. "Naughty Boy" was written boldly in red paint, or I could only hope it was red paint. I remember dropping the letter and running in search of my parents, tears cascading down my face. I told them about the note, saying that it was from Santa, but they looked at me as if I had gone insane. They reminded me that Santa wasn't real, and to add to my lunacy, the letter was gone, as if the mountain of wrapping paper swallowed all evidence of my delusion. I even jumped into the pile like some seal jumping into water, doing my best to find it. But there was nothing. There was no proof that what I saw was real. The next year, my parents tried to stick me in that same line, and I argued to no end that I wanted nothing to do with it. I could see how perturbed they were, especially my father. That's when they told me if I wasn't going to act like a child during Christmas, then they were going to treat me like an adult, and that's when I was forced to help out at the store. That Christmas morning, another mysterious gift found its way burrowed underneath our tree, only presenting itself when I was alone. Like the year prior, it was a simple note, one that needed no clarification. "Naughty Boy." The incoming years soared right by, and every winter I would have a front row seat when it came to seeing that horrid man, him taking his throne each year with such hubris as he passed judgment to all the patiently waiting children. I continued receiving mystery gifts, or I should say, notes, with the message always the same. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was one of my stupid friends playing some lifelong prank on me. Knowing how we treated each other, the thought wasn't too outrageous. I was always befuddled by how our town was able to reserve the same Santa. I knew he wasn't from our community, and seeing how old he was, I'd assumed and hoped that he would pass. But as I entered my teen years, it quickly became evident that the geezer had some real fight in him. By the time I reached high school, the bougie man that would sit in front of our store bothered me less, and my threatening letters seemed more comical than nefarious. As usual, the corpse of my lonely town sprung to life as the holiday rolled around. The walking zombies that I called my neighbors were now filled with hope, understanding that the next few months would supplement half their annual income. I, on the other hand, wasn't so keen. By this point, Just like any other teenager, my thoughts were consumed by girls, and working in my parents' candle store wasn't at the top of my list when trying to attract one. I begged my parents to not have to work this particular year. I told them I would do all the house chores and that I would even reshingle the roof. Just anything to get out of working at the store. It wasn't that I was ashamed of my parents, but I was tired of seeing the kids from out of town look at me with such disdain. If it were any other time period, I could visualize them flicking me a penny as a tip. I couldn't stand the thought, especially because of Kimberly. She was from our neighboring city. Like me, she didn't come from money. But each year her parents would drag her here to celebrate the holiday, stopping in to buy some small candles for caroling. The first time I saw her, I must have been 10 years old, and right away I was completely smitten. She was beautiful, a single dove in a sea of pigeons. I remember always blushing whenever she and her family would come in, and I did my best to hide behind the counter in hopes that my mother would attend to them. Laughter tearing into my eardrums like daggers, I tried not to make eye contact with the dreadful man. But to my dismay, he pulled my gaze towards his, our eyes clashing in the middle like shooting stars colliding into one another. It was disturbing. His once flawless laughter faded, and all that remained was a stoic frown of indifference as I waited anxiously for him to speak. I could see how old the man was. His skin was thin as paper, and his ocean blue eyes were sharper than the Atlantic itself. His breath inundated my face with its horrid stench, as I practically gagged out of disgust. But before I could let out a subtle cough, the man spoke. "You are not a good boy. You are naughty," he told me with a raspy voice, anger seeping out of his tongue as each syllable lashed me with its heavy tone. I just stared at him in bewilderment. I felt like crying, but no tears would accumulate and no whimpers could be manifested. Instead, I remained frozen, a defense mechanism that could only be compared to a doo-doo bird. An astonishing snarl formed on his melted face as his pathetic, dirty gray beard scratched the top of my forehead. I don't know how long I was on Santa's lap. It could have been for hours. Time seemed to dissolve into an infinite void. The next memory I have is of my parents talking to me outside of the designated area that was guarded off as Santa's workshop, inquiring what I had asked for, their smiling faces completely clueless to what I had just experienced. Being a kid, I questioned my own memory, thinking that perhaps I had fallen asleep in line, never meeting the jolly old man. I could still hear his laughter simmer around the narrow streets of our town center, and it sent chills up my spine. I didn't bother answering my parents. I just told them that I wanted to go home. The grinding of my insides didn't allow me to say many words, but I think they could tell by my dead stare that it was time to leave. After that, I did my best not to let the bizarre encounter ruin my cheerful spirit. Back then, I rather enjoyed the ambience that the season brought. Snowflakes and eggnog, especially my mother's pumpkin pie. Even though we were poor, I still received several gifts, usually some trinkets that could be bought at the dollar store, but I didn't care. The thought of someone thinking of me filled my heart with joy. That Christmas morning was like the ones prior. I opened several presents. They were mainly small-scale action figures, some knockoff superheroes that no one had ever heard of that resembled Spider-Man. My parents enjoyed seeing me relish in the delight of new toys. The aftermath of shredded wrapping paper glistening in our dimly lit room was a clear indication that present time was over. I remember my parents walking away, getting ready for our annual Christmas breakfast, and telling me they would clean later. As they walked away, I noticed there was still one unopened gift hiding behind our tree. The wrapping was to perfection, a shiny silk red bow displayed in the center of the present. My heart accelerated with pure bliss, thinking I had discovered some secret. Kimberly, where the hell are you? I've been waiting for an hour. Hello, I'm going home, it read. It was a series of texts, all from her asking about my whereabouts. I stood perplexed at how this was even possible. The timestamps showed that she was here at this moment. Midnight. I flipped my phone closed and looked at the time on the small screen. It said it was 3 a.m. How was that possible? I left my house exactly at 11:30. It wouldn't have taken me more than 15 minutes to walk to downtown. I remained frozen with uncertainty about how this was even possible. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I finally saw that shadow move. Whoever was standing under the branches of the tree finally turned to look at me. I practically dropped my phone from mere sight, and it then started to walk towards me, all while those damn bells got louder. I didn't bother looking back. I ran as fast as I could home, quickly crawling in through my window and locking it shut. I stayed up most of the night staring out my bedroom window, ready for that shadow to try and enter. I really didn't know what I would have done if it had breached in, but luckily that never happened. Instead, I woke up with the largest headache on the floor, and a pile of my own sweat drenched my clothes. The next day, I shrugged off the bizarre encounter as nothing more than another prank done by my friends, and I laughed, thinking that they indeed had gotten me good, although that didn't explain the time lapse I had experienced, and no matter how much I scratched my head, no reasonable explanation came to me other than that I must have fallen into some weird trance, like sleepwalking. It reminded me of that time I had memory loss after sitting on Santa's lap. Even though I was happy to dismiss the strange event, Kimberly didn't forgive me. When she and her family came into the shop the next day to buy their usual candles, I dragged her to the side as her parents picked out which scent they wanted. It was clear that she was angry with me. Her beautiful face displayed a frown that I still found endearing. She had told me that she waited for almost an hour and said that I was playing some devilish prank on her. She told me she could hear me walking around the tree, jumping out of sight anytime. She tried catching a glimpse of the person. I told her it wasn't me, that I never made it to the tree while she was there, and I told her about my bewildering experience, but she didn't buy it. She told me that she never wanted to hear from me again, and to my dismay, she blocked my number. Seeing her push those few buttons and eliminate me from her phone was the most gut-wrenching devastation I've ever felt. No matter how much I pleaded with her to reconsider, she left me destroyed, walking back to her parents, as if I no longer existed. That same day, the man that I've grown to despise took his seat at his throne, all to the cheers of our small community. With my heart shattered, I didn't even bother looking out the window. Though as the day passed, I felt eyes on me, like someone was leering at me. That feeling you get when you think you're being followed. It wasn't until the cheering subsided did I have a chance to calculate where my sixth sense was picking up the threat. Of course, the gaze that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand was coming from him. Santa. When a child wasn't sitting on his lap, he would direct his mischievous stare towards me. The vicious snarl that frightened me as a kid is now more sinister than ever. I closed the blinds to the store, no longer wanting to see anyone. I wanted the world to disappear, or better yet, I wanted to melt away into oblivion, just like our candles. Even with the blinds closed, I could still hear the man's dreadful laughter, him belching out that phony chuckle almost every minute. I took out my phone and looked at Kimberly's phone number, and I could feel tears form on the corner of my eyelids. It had only been hours, but it felt like she had been out of my life for years. I closed the store down early and told my parents that I just didn't feel well, which was the truth. My heartache was beyond any illness. The rest of the week, I had hoped that Kimberly would change her mind. I dreamt that any moment she would walk into the store, smiling and showering me with her light, but that never happened. Instead, Santa's laughter would haunt my thoughts. Days passed and Christmas was soon approaching. Kimberly would be leaving home after the holiday, and the thought left me empty, though Santa too would be leaving, which brought a bit of a smile to my sad face. I knew if I was ever going to get Kim to forgive me, I had to get her a gift, one that would represent how much she meant to me. And I pondered throughout the day what that could be. As the sun set, our town's Christmas lights sprung to life, the light intruding through our store windows, and that's when the idea came to me. My eyes followed the shimmering hues to their source, most of them coming from our Christmas tree, and as my eyes crawled upward, they finally came to rest on top of the tree, the star that shined above. I was going to steal our own star from on top of the tree. It was a symbol of pure light, as Kimberly's smile was to me. I knew the gesture would be taken, and our relationship would be restored to what it once was. It was Christmas Eve, and the festivities that were celebrated in our town square slowly died down as everyone retreated back to their homes and rental lodges. I stood in our candle shop, waiting for silence to overwhelm our city streets. I told my parents I would lock up and do inventory that night, something they were surprised by my volunteering for. The ruse would be simple. I would wait for everyone to be gone, and then I would climb that monstrosity and steal the star from up top. I waited for the clock to strike midnight. I exited our store, looking up at how tall I would have to climb, and the sight almost caused me to change my mind. But I knew I had no other choice. I needed to do this for her. Before locking the door, I remembered that horrid shadow that I had seen before and grabbed a few candles in hopes of illuminating my path underneath. I lit several of the candles and placed them at the base of the tree. I inhaled deeply, strapping my backpack around me, and looked up at all the branches. I then began to climb. I slithered between branches while the occasional colossal ornament hit me, the bristles from the tree branches cutting my cheeks as I climbed higher. The smell of real pine invaded my nostrils. I surprisingly found it to be calming, better than any scent we could ever make in our cheap candles. Eventually, I made it to the top. I dare not look down, knowing the height would scare me to the point where I might lose my balance. I grabbed out to the star, its glare directly at me. I pulled it off the tree and disconnected the power cable. To my astonishment, the darn thing still illuminated. I then placed it in my bag, hoping the light wouldn't be so bright that someone could clearly tell I had it in my bag. Perched on top of the tree, I took a moment to enjoy the view. I looked over our small town, the streets covered in white snow. It really did look like something out of a Ron Oliver film. The subtle breeze soothed my scratched face as it cautiously rocked me back and forth on the branch I was sitting on. In that moment, I processed the realization of how outlandish this endeavor was. I knew some silly gift would not change Kimberly's mind. Or even worse, she might think of me as some criminal. I shook my head, disappointed in myself, and pulled my pack in front of me, ready to put the star back in its rightful place. But before I could, the tree began to move violently. At first, I thought it was an earthquake. Just from the sheer force, I grabbed onto the trunk of the tree tightly as I could feel my legs losing their footing. I looked around trying to figure out what was happening. And that's when I heard it. The sound that has terrified me since I was a child. Santa's laughter. I carefully peeked my head over, trying to get a glimpse through the branches. And sure enough, there he was, at the base of the tree. He was shaking the trunk as he laughed uncontrollably. He then raised his gaze towards mine. I retreated my head back into the branches and contemplated what I could do. I couldn't climb down. He was waiting for me down there, but the more I hesitated, the more violently he shook the tree. "I'll put it back," I yelled out, but got no response. Instead, he had stopped. The world returned to normal as the wind continued rattling the leaves, but then the shaking returned, but this time in bursts. It would shake, then stop, only to shake again a few seconds later. The laughter also returned, and that's when I realized it was him climbing up the tree. I brushed away several of the branches, getting a clear view of his menacing frown, a look of pure evil garnished across his elderly face, and the madness that displayed rage in his eyes shimmered in the moonlight. "Naughty boy," he said to me while showing his horrifying grin. He seemed to be climbing with ease, almost natural to his biology. I remained petrified, still unsure of what I could do. He was closing the distance. I could almost smell his repulsive breath, and the stench sprung my mind into action. I knew I had to climb down the tree on the opposite side. I jumped down several branches at once, making sure to leap at angles. I knew if I was going to get out of this alive, I needed to stay vigilant and not let my fear stop me. Eventually, we were at the same level, but on opposite ends, and his egregious hand reached out, grabbing mine. "Naughty boy," he once again screeched out. He began belching his all-too-familiar chuckle as I shook and squirmed. Trying to release his tight grip, I began to sob, begging him to let go and saying that I was sorry for taking the star. By some miracle, I was able to break free, but at a heavy cost because I lost my balance and fell to the ground from 20 feet above. I crashed through branches, which gratefully slowed my fall, eventually hitting the floor with a heavy thud. I gasped out with all of my breath as my lungs felt collapse. My vision was blurry, but I didn't waste time, and I got up and tried my best to run. I could see our store, and I still had the keys. I just needed to make it inside and lock myself in until daybreak. My hands reached into my pocket, fumbling around for the key. I could hear that laughter flowing into my ears. I knew he was in pursuit and quickly dove into our store once I had opened the door. I turned to lock it and saw the most devastating sight: the candles that I had left at the base of the tree. I must have knocked them over, but now the tree had caught fire, the embers overwhelming the pine needles and ornaments. It didn't take long for the flames to reach the sky, and as I looked up through the window, there he was, still belching out his horrid chuckle. He remained unmoved, the flames tearing into his flesh as his withered face began to melt. "Naughty boy," he still murmured out. I looked on with disbelief, all too horrified to even call for the fire department. Soon the amber glows engulfed the tree, and it tilted over, falling hard to the ground like some axeman cutting down a tree in the woods. It landed on one of our neighboring stores, and soon it too was on fire, still shaking. I stood there watching our entire town square melt away like one of our candles, and by some grace of God, our store was the only one that was left untouched. Eventually, the fire department showed up only to vanquish the few remaining flames, but virtually everything was a mere shadow of its former glory. All ash and all things returned to dust. The next morning, as one could have guessed, a town meeting was formed. Out-of-towners and members of our community wept and mourned the loss of our town center. Christmas was ruined, but worse, our city never recovered. No one came back to our town. There was no use for a former Christmas wonderland. And most businesses closed down, including our candle store. I waited for the police to contact me, for them to tell me they knew I was there, and that they had found the body. But to my bewilderment, that phone call never happened. It was never reported that they found a body, or that it was because of our candles. They blamed the wiring. They said that the star got unplugged and energized the tree. I still had the star stuffed away in my backpack, and I kept it with me for years, not wanting anyone to know that it was me. I don't even know what happened to Kimberly other than the photos that she would post on her social media accounts, but I am still enchanted by her smile. I know what the footsteps are. I know who they are from, and I used to think it was just my guilt and penance for my crimes, but it wasn't until I reached my 30s that I started to hear the laughter. The chuckle amplifying with each horrid step is him. He knows I still have the star. It's Christmas Eve, and I honestly do not want to fall asleep. I think tonight is the night. I fear when I close my eyes and cautiously fall into the land of slumber that those abysmal words will slowly creep their way into my dreams. Because he was right. I was a naughty boy. Enough time had passed to make even the most painful memory of senior year a distant blur. I have done everything in my power to keep it that way. I have visited countless therapists and hypnotists, and even moved to the other side of the globe, just to keep the memories at bay. For over a decade, I had managed to not think about her, but the moment I saw the name on the package, all the memories rushed back into my skull with the tenacity of a migraine. From Grace Morgan, the wrapping paper read in big blocky letters. Your ex-lover clarified a small scribble below, as if I could forget. Dear Pig AI, haven't thought about you in a really long time. But I heard you got married. Congrats. I also heard you guys are expecting. So much for it should be a punishable crime to bring another sentient life into this world. Ha. Ha ha. High school. Congrats on the kid. So, since you're all hitched up now, I just wanted to pop in and say goodbye. I read an article about how a lot of marriages these days are broken up because it's so easy to break up with an ex. I just wanted to cut off that temptation for you. If you ever find yourself reminiscing about the nights we spent together as kids, don't you have a wife? Haha. Anyhow, just so you know, you're not allowed to write to me when you get lonely. Have a great life, Gracie. Ehees. I baked you and yours some gingerbread men. Enjoy. 2 figures of blue pinstriped suits and bright red frosting sit on my table. The gingerbread men have roughly drawn smiles of frosting and dull silver candies for eyes. They sit on my table, and I watch them with fear. Before I dated Grace Morgan, I loved Laura Miller. Laura was my first real taste of emotional intimacy, and for the longest time, I was certain she would be my last. We knew each other since we were kids, but we didn't start dating until we were 16. From the night our friendship turned into something more, we were inseparable. Her parents weren't big fans of me, or of any teenage boy interested in their daughter. For that matter, Laura's father would drop her off at school early in the morning and then pick her up right after her extracurriculars. Our love, however, snuck past his vigilant eye. For all he knew, school started about an hour before our first homeroom class, and for all he knew, his daughter had a plethora of vague after-school activities that kept her in school well into the late afternoon. I think Laura's mother might have suspected that her daughter was stretching out her schedule to spend time with a boy, but if she did, she never interfered. By the time we reached senior year, she would call me husband, and I would call her wife. I had no doubt in my heart that we would eventually make those nicknames a reality. For what it's worth, I don't think Laura had any doubts either. We were young, in love, and bursting at the seams with hormone-fueled happiness. But then, one Wednesday morning, Laura missed our early rendezvous. She didn't come for homeroom or any of the classes, and she was nowhere to be found when the after-school activities started. This was back before the days of smartphones or social media, but I still had a flip phone that I tried to contact Laura with. She didn't answer any of my texts, and all my calls went unanswered. When I got home that day, I saw no other choice than to just hope she would show up at school the next morning. Yet the longer I sat alone, the longer I tried to come up with an explanation for why Laura would miss school without any warning, the more uneasy I got. A part of me was worried that someone from the school had contacted Laura's parents about our relationship and that her father would lock her in her room until a suitable husband was found. I knew the man had a short fuse. When the sun set, I hopped a bus to Laura's neighborhood in hopes of throwing a pebble or two at her window to make sure she was okay. There was no car in the driveway. Her house was completely dark. No one was home. The thought of Laura's father finding out about our relationship wasn't pleasant, but I started to hope it was true. I started to hope it was true because, in the pit of my stomach, I felt an eerie certainty that something much worse had happened. It wasn't until homeroom the following day that I found out what happened. Mr. Elgar, our biology teacher, came in to tell us the news. Elgar was a shrewd old man who was famous all across the school for a breed of academic strictness that bordered on sadism. When he came into our homeroom that morning, however, his shoulders slumped and his voice lacked authority. He said we might be wondering why our classmate Laura has been missing for the past 2 days. He was saddened to announce that she would not be coming back. Laura Miller was dead. She had fallen sick with stomach problems on Tuesday night and died on Wednesday. Her parents requested that the service remain family only, but the school counselor was available to help process feelings during lunch break. Past the silence of the room, I could hear the hush of an incoming faint. I excused myself and made for the bathroom. No one stopped me, not even Mr. Elgar. We made no effort to hide our relationship in front of the teachers. The mere act of walking was a Herculean task. I kept on trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't. By the time I managed to hide in one of the stalls, the world was nothing but a curtain of static. I don't know whether I actually fainted or how long I spent in that horrible fugue state. Time had lost all meaning to me. Life had lost all meaning to me. I just sat in that stall with my head cradled in my hands, trying to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare. I don't know how long I sat there, but I recall the voice that convinced me I wasn't dreaming. Laura really cared about you. We were working on our biolab on Tuesday, and she wouldn't stop talking about how much she loved you and how the two of you were going to get married. I'm sorry for your loss. It was Grace Morgan. She'd always sit in the back of the class and keep to herself. If it wasn't for the occasional class presentation, I wouldn't even have recognized her voice. I didn't know she was sick. When I left her house, she seemed fine. When we were finishing off the lab, though, she told me that if anything happened to her, she would want you to be happy. Maybe she knew. Maybe Laura knew something was wrong, and she wanted to make sure you could move on. When Grace said that to me, I got angry. I yelled at her to get out of the boys' bathroom, leave me alone, and never speak about Laura again. In that moment, with my face wet with tears and cold sweat, I thought Grace was talking about Laura to console me. I thought she was trying to help. She wasn't. Now, years later, I know she wasn't. I did not cope with Laura's death well. Initially, everyone around me was understanding. My parents pulled me out of school for the next 2 weeks. My teachers, even Mr. Elger, extended all my assignment deadlines, and eventually, all of them, excluding Mr. Elger, gave me automatic as for whatever work was due. For the first few weeks, everyone was beyond understanding. The loss I suffered, however, would take much more than a few weeks to mourn. Sitting in class was never my strong suit. After Laura died, each minute spent behind my desk was agony. I'd inevitably start to daydream, and each and every fantasy took me straight back to her. I was hopeless. The only place I found any solace were video games. Both my parents worked, so sneaking back home wasn't an issue. Classes were crowded enough to only have one round of roll call during homeroom, so I managed to keep up perfect attendance as well. The few tests and presentations I showed up for went poorly, but I was still somehow managing to coast above failing grades. I didn't wonder why I was still passing my classes even though I was never around to hand in an assignment. I just presumed the teachers were inflating my grades out of pity. I was far too busy playing World of Warcraft to question anything about my life. Decades later, you'll hear folks sing the praises of how they love the communal aspect of the game, but I didn't interact with a single player. I sat behind that computer and clicked away hours of my life because some primitive part of me liked watching the numbers go up. I hoped that if I sat behind that computer for long enough, I would grind away whatever part of me was making it impossible to move on. That didn't help. It just made me more miserable. I stewed in my pit of digital misery until one day, someone rang my doorbell. I wasn't meant to be home, so I turned up my earphones and continued gaming. The bell went off a couple more times before it finally quieted down. About an hour later, while I was raiding the fridge downstairs, I noticed an envelope slipped under the front door. From Grace Morgan read the top of the envelope in big blocky letters. Your classmate clarified a small scribble below. Inside the envelope was a short note written in a rushed hand. Grace said that she missed me in school and that she hoped I would come back soon. She made me something and wanted to give it to me personally, but since I wasn't answering the door, she left it on the front porch. She hoped a bird wouldn't get to it before I did. On the other side of the door, there was a chocolate-glazed cheesecake. There was no sign of any birds getting to the cake before I did, but I was reticent to touch the cake regardless. I didn't know Grace. Aside from the one strange conversation we had in the boys' bathroom the day after Laura died, I couldn't recall any other interactions I had with her. The thought of eating the cake definitely gave me pause, but my fridge didn't hold anything appetizing, and I hadn't eaten lunch. After a long deliberation, I cut off a small, cautionary slice. It was delicious. It didn't take me long to eat the whole cake. The next morning, when I came to have my head counted during homeroom, I found Grace waiting for me in front of the school. I wasn't in much of a conversational mood, but I did feel like I owed her a thank you. She was overjoyed to hear that I enjoyed the cake, and past my protests, she promised she would bake more. I don't recall doing so, but I must have mentioned that I was spending a lot of time playing World of Warcraft. That's the only explanation I can come up with for why, around an hour after school let out, I bumped into Grace's digital avatar in the realm of Azareth. I had spent an inhuman amount of time building up my character over the past couple of months, but Grace, seemingly unfamiliar with the game, was on a higher level than me. I tried questioning her about how she made so much progress in such little time, but Grace seemed wholly uninterested in talking about video games. She just wanted to make sure I was okay. Conversations about my mental state in person were far too much to handle at that point. When they were abstracted through digital avatars, however, I found myself a lot more talkative. My orc warrior told Grace's dark elf huntress that accepting Laura's death was beyond difficult, and that without her life, all meaning would have been lost. It felt good to talk about it, even if it was through the keyboard. What felt even better, what made me feel truly seen, was how Grace responded. She once again talked about how much Laura spoke about me during their shared biolab, and then Grace talked about a tragedy of her own. Grace never knew her dad, and when she was in kindergarten, her mother died of a sudden heart attack. Grace knew the pain of sudden loss well, and unlike me, her loss sent her down the rough path of orphanages and foster homes. For the first time in a long time, I was able to pry myself away from my own tragedy and feel empathy for someone else. I listened to Grace's story, and when she was done, I asked her how she was able to stay so well adjusted. She told me about Candleland. After her mother had died, while Grace was being thrown around our great nation's orphanage system, she escaped to her own private world of imagination. It was childish, but daydreams about Candyland's frosting-tipped skyscrapers and its candy-coated inhabitants gave Grace a place where she could mourn and heal on her own time. The journey had not been pleasant, she said, but years later she knew that her mother would be proud of her. She always wanted her daughter to follow her dreams, and now that Grace's foster parents owned a bakery, she was able to make all the sugar-covered treats she could hope for. It wasn't just Grace's mother who was looking down on her in pride, though. The inhabitants of Candyland, Grace claimed, were also proud of how she lived her life. It was nice to finally speak to someone about the pain I was feeling, even if through the lips of a pixelated ogre. Talking to Grace felt nice, although the way she spoke about Candyland was somewhat unsettling. She described it at length, as if there were a real city made of candy that she would regularly visit. Her fixation on the made-up place was strange, but I was not one to judge. In a way, World of Warcraft had become my own personal Candyland. The digital landscapes of Azareth felt infinitely more real than anything else in my life at the time. In comparison, Grace's obsession with a made-up place, filled with smiling gingerbread men and clouds of cotton candy, seemed perfectly normal. Back then, nothing about Grace seemed dangerous. Over the next few weeks, we became friends. At first, our friendship was purely virtual, but as time went on, I found myself hanging around school well after homeroom. Grace always knew how to cheer me up from my depressed states, be it with one of our many inside jokes or with the baked treats she would bring every day. She quickly went from someone I barely noticed to my best friend in school. I got along with Grace, but the rest of my high school social life had taken a dive. In general, my classmates were nice and understanding of my sorrow, but among the cafeteria cliques, a nasty rumor had started spreading about how Laura had died. People would whisper that she was poisoned and that the person responsible for her death was none other than me. Apparently, I killed Laura because I didn't want to go through the awkwardness of breaking up with her. Apparently, I killed Laura so that I could start dating Grace. When the whispered rumors started gaining volume, I retreated back to my digital nest, But Grace coaxed me out of it soon enough. There was no truth to those rumors, she said. I shouldn't let other people make me feel bad, she said. I had her after all, she said. Even though I did none of the homework and handed in none of the essays, my grades didn't suffer. In fact, I even got congratulated on an essay well written by the occasional teacher I would pass in the hallway. I wrote no essays, but I didn't question the compliments. I had other things on my mind. The one class where I was falling behind was Mr. Elgar's biology class. Mr. Elgar would often keep me after class and ask extensive questions about the homework assignments. My essays, the same essays I had no memory of writing, were apparently very different from the ones I handed in last year. When I wasn't able to answer any of his questions, he started to ask me personal questions about how I was coping. In retrospect, the old man probably just cared about his student. He wanted to make sure that I was actually learning in his class, handing in my own work, and not sliding into some grief-fueled cycle of self-destruction. In retrospect, the old man probably cared, but back then, in high school, Mr. Elgar was just an archetypal villain. To my teenage head, he wasn't trying to help. He was just flexing his authority over me. My relationship with Mr. Elgar was on a steady decline, but it wasn't until a week before final exams that it reached a breaking point. Right after homeroom, Mr. Elgar pulled me out of math class and summoned me into his classroom. When I got there, Grace was already sitting behind his table, crying. That week we were meant to turn in an assignment concerning the Krebs cycle. Mr. Elgar said, the assignment that had been turned in under my name had the same exact mistakes that the paper by Miss Morgan had. In fact, on closer inspection, all of the assignments that were turned in over the past months had the same exact mistakes that Miss Morgan's papers had. I had suspected that Grace was helping me out with my assignments, but it never came up in our conversations. It wasn't until we were sitting in that classroom that she confessed. Through a flood of tears, she told Mr. Elgar that she had been turning in assignments under my name. She knew academic dishonesty was bad, but she felt for me. When she was young, she said her mother died of a sudden brain hemorrhage, and Grace knew what it was like to lose someone you deeply cared about. Grace begged for forgiveness, and when Mr. Elgar's eyes suggested none, she begged that only she be punished. I knew nothing of the academic dishonesty, she said. I could not be blamed. Grace's pleas seemed to have the slightest bit of effect on Mr. Elgar. At the start of the meeting, he insisted that we were both going to the principal's office and would be disciplined before the day was done. But after Grace's tear-filled appeal, he said he would take the weekend to think it over. Mr. Elgar showed grace that day, but we were teenagers unable to comprehend it. The moment we got out of earshot, we were both calling him every insult under the sun. Who was he to try to prevent us from graduating? Over the weekend, I feared for the worst. I feared that my parents would be called in, that I would be suspended, and that I would have to redo my senior year. It turns out I had nothing to fear. A substitute teacher taught us biology on Monday. That same teacher came in for the rest of the week, bearing little information about where Mr. Elgar had gone. It wasn't until Friday assembly that the students were informed of what had happened. Mr. Elgar had fallen sick over the weekend and had spent the past few days in the hospital. He would not be returning. Mr. Elgar was dead. It wasn't until after the assembly, when I saw how wide Grace's smile was, that I started to suspect something was wrong. I had my suspicions, but I made an effort to not pursue them too far. Along with Mr. Elgar's departure, all of my fears of expulsion had disappeared. In fact, when exam season came around, Mr. Elgar's death proved to be quite convenient. Whoever was marking the papers instead of him was beyond charitable with the grades. I didn't do well on my final exam, but I did pass. I guess, in a way, I felt like I owed Grace. She was the only one checking up on me after Laura's death. She had covered for me on all of the assignments I had missed, and she fed me all those delicious cakes. I guess, in a way, I knew she was also responsible for Mr. Elgar being out of the picture as well. She was the one who brought up the idea of dating. I was beyond emotionally unavailable, but I guess, in a way, being with her felt like I was paying her back. It wasn't until a couple weeks before graduation that I realized just how involved Grace was in the events of the past year. We went to prom together, but we didn't stay long. Right at the start of the event, our graduating class was treated to a montage of photographs set to Green Day's Time of Your Life. The moment a picture of Laura and me appeared on screen, I couldn't bear to be in that auditorium. Grace was more than happy to make an early exit with me. I wanted to go home. I wanted to be alone and melt my brain to World of Warcraft and not think about the girl I had loved so dearly. Grace, however, insisted that we first drive to the local makeout spot. I was definitely not in the mood, but I took her there regardless. We did, after all, only get one prom. The mood was far from romantic, but as Grace tried to console me, the atmosphere in the car shifted to something wholly different. She said that it was natural to still feel strong emotions half a year after losing a loved one. When her mother died to that drunk driver, Grace said she was scared of cars for years. There were always inconsistencies in her stories. Maybe I noticed them before and willfully ignored them, or maybe I was too absorbed in my sorrow to see the signs clearly. But that night, in that car, they became unavoidable. I asked Grace how her mother had died. Was it a heart attack? Was it a brain hemorrhage? Was it a drunk driver? For the briefest moment, all the warmth drained from her face. In the dim light of the far-off street lamps, I could see her pupils turn into two halffuls of black nestled in a pale sea of blue. Then, with a couple of blinks, her eyes turned wet. She would never hurt me, she said. She had loved me ever since grade school, learned my handwriting, bought a World of Warcraft account online to spend more time with me, and stood up for me whenever people would suggest that I had to do something with Laura's death. She loved me, and she was so happy we were finally together, and she wanted me to know that she would never hurt me. I asked, again, how her mother died. She blinked again, shedding a couple tears and all the emotion out of her eyes. In a low, husky voice, Grace told me that her mother wasn't a good woman. She was a religious zealot who controlled every aspect of her life and considered everything to be sin. Toys were sin, dinosaurs were sin, video games were sin, and sugar was sin. Grace's mother was a tyrant that needed to be overthrown. Grace couldn't do so on her own. She was just a little girl back then, after all. Grace couldn't get rid of her mother alone, so she got some help from her friends in Candyland. In an oven, she brought her friends to life, and they, as a show of thanks, took care of the tyrant in her life. I asked if her friends from Candyland also took care of Mr. Algar. She smiled and nodded, not hiding her pride. Yes, she said. It was thanks to her friends in Candyland that we both managed to pass biology and avoid expulsion. She baked Mr. Algar some gingerbread men and delivered them to his house during the weekend. He thought they were a peace offering. In reality, they were Trojan horses. The moment she confessed to Mr. Algar's murder, I knew exactly what else she was guilty of. The words got stuck in my throat, so I simply drove. As Grace pulled at my shoulder and insisted I stop the car so we could calmly talk, I drove. I drove Grace back to the bakery above, where her foster parents worked, and it was only once I stopped the car that I asked the question that had been tearing away at my sanity. I asked Grace if her friends in Candyland had anything to do with Laura's death. She gasped. She gasped in the most theatric, practiced way a person could grasp, and then she vehemently denied that she had anything to do with Laura's death. She said she and Laura were the best of friends and that she would never harm her. She also knew just how much I cared about Laura, and she would never do anything to hurt me. Grace swore up and down that she had nothing to do with Laura's sudden death, but she was a bad actor. I asked her to get out of the car. She refused. I asked her to get out of the car if she really loved me. The moment she was out the door, I sped off. I never saw Grace again. I never answered the door when she rang, and I threw out all of the cakes she left on our porch. When graduation came around, I went off to visit my cousin in Europe and got my diploma in the mail. The method through which Grace dispatched her victims was a mystery to me, but I wasn't willing to take any risks. What was meant to be a 2-month Euro trip ended up being a permanent move. I didn't want to go back home. I didn't want to go back to the place so filled with memories of Laura. Most importantly, though, I didn't want to see Grace ever again. It took years, but I found some semblance of normalcy overseas. Therapists, hypnotists, and self-help books have helped me make peace with Laura's death, but the question of Grace Morgan and her methods of murder has forever eluded me. Instead of facing them, I elected to forget. For years, it worked. For over a decade, I had managed to not think about Grace Morgan, but now, as I sit here next to the package of gingerbread men, I find myself thinking about her again. 2 figures of blue pinstriped suits and bright red frosting sit on my table. The gingerbread men have roughly drawn smiles of frosting and dull silver candies for eyes. I've got a bit of a weird career, but it's lucrative. People often get nostalgic over old shows from their childhood and want to watch them again. The problem with that is that most shows from before the 1990s aren't well archived. These days, you can go on Amazon and buy a box set of your favorite show, but it's not always that easy. There are whole shows that exist in little more than clips and snippets now, and some shows that have been lost to time entirely. That's where people like me come in. We pick up VHS tapes from yard sales, Goodwill, and all over the place and see what's on them. Most of the time, it's useless, but sometimes you luck out and find a show that someone recorded that turns out to be some of that lost media. If it sounds tedious, that's because it is. If it doesn't sound lucrative, think again. I paid 8 months of rent last year off lost episodes of a certain cartoon show that I found cassettes for at a church garage sale. I paid a good chunk of my student loans off with some early run episodes of As the World Turns a few years ago. The money is there. You just have to be willing to look for it. That was how I found myself going through tapes at Goodwill on the day in question. I was looking for the usual stuff. Disney VHS, old or obscure cartoons, and hand-labeled tapes from someone who decided to record their favorite show. Pickings were slim, and when I asked Doug, the guy who runs Goodwill in my area, if he had any more, he got a funny look before nodding slowly. I don't think he knew what he had, not really. That look was more akin to the look of getting 2 birds with 1 stone. Come with me, maybe you can help each other out. He took me into the sorting area and into a storage room where he had 6 moldy old boxes that had been haphazardly filled with old VHS. I can't sell them, and you're the only person who comes in who wants them. I was about to throw them away, but if you want to take them with you, then you can pitch the ones you don't want. I'd rather have the storage space, personally. I had to stop myself from salivating at the sight of all those tapes. What untold treasures might lie there? What lost media could I uncover on these? The possibilities were limitless, and I told him I'd take them. One thing, he said, bringing me up short before I noticed his grin. You have to load them yourself. He laughed when I went to the truck and came back with a handcart. This wasn't my first rodeo. I had them in the truck in 2 trips and paid him for the other box he had on the floor as a show of good faith. I moved them into the house and prepared to start rummaging. I ordered some Chinese food from Dante's and got comfy, prepared for a long night of treasure hunting. As I popped the first one into the VCR, I kept hooked on the living room, set for just such an occasion. I just knew I was going to find something worthwhile here amongst these dusty old tapes. Boy, I didn't know how right I was. The VCR clicked and clacked before giving me nothing but static and the sound of plastic tape being eaten. I quickly shut it off, taking the tape out delicately as I fed the ribbon back in. This happened sometimes with older tapes, and as the spools reset, I tried it again. The label said Jeopardy, but after pressing play delivered the same results twice more. I tossed it into a plastic bag I had set aside for just such an occasion and moved on to the next one. It was not a great start, but I was hoping to make up for it with the next one. 5 tapes later, I had a recording of the news from October 5, 1983. Some home movies of a trip to the seashore in which a woman and a dog ran along the beach. 2 tapes that contained popular episodes of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and one of those old Disney specials that used to come on sometimes where they showcase the art process and upcoming projects. The 2 TMNT tapes went into the bag. They had cut the commercials, and the episodes were popular ones you could find anywhere, along with the Disney presentation since it had no commercials and was also well documented. I saved the news broadcast. I had a guy who liked to collect those, and the home movies too for another guy who used them to make odd little art pieces online. Both tapes would probably net me less than $20, so I knew I'd need to find more. The next 5 were similar fare, and I added 2 more news broadcasts to the stack, a wedding video to a new stack, and 2 more broken tapes to the bag. The last of the 2 really stung because the label had read Jerry's Place, and that one was hard to come across after the accident at the studio during the 2nd season. As such, any footage from Jerry's Place was worth cash money, and I dug it out after thinking about it so I could take it to Daryl and see if he could get anything from it. Daryl usually cleaned or fixed VHS film, and his work was often worth the money. The next 4 hours practically flew by as I watched tape after tape of home movies, cartoons, news broadcasts, game shows, and 1,000 other things. Some of them I saved because they had shows I could sell. Some of them I saved because they had commercials that people would want clips of. Some of them I just saved because the footage would or could be used by someone to make something. And in this business, you never know what somebody might pay for. For the most part, I only really ended up trashing the ones that didn't work, and I would have a full day of transferring some of these into a digital format so I could send them to people and assess their interest. As the first box came up empty, I put the bag of broken tape into it and pulled over the second box. Right on top of the stack, meticulously written, was a VHS labeled Christmas Morning. I picked it up and looked at it, sucking my teeth dubiously. The tape looked a little worse for wear, and it was missing one of the plastic glass windows that show the reels. I wasn't sure it was going to work when I pushed it in, and when I hit play, it made a crunchy sound that made me even less sure. I pulled it out, the tape trying to stay behind in the machine, and I figured the filament would break as I tried to put it to rights. It was a shame because kids opening gifts on Christmas morning were usually favorites for creepy YouTube videos, advertisements, or other things. I wound it back up, slipping it into the VCR, and when I hit play, my expectations were very low. When it played, I was pleasantly surprised. As it continued to play, my surprise would become far less pleasant. The static parted begrudgingly, and I could see a cheery living room with a Christmas tree and a floor full of presents. There was a happily crackling fire set behind the Christmas tree, and the whole scene looked very picturesque. The date on the camera informed me it was December 25th, 1982, and it seemed from the noises behind the camera that someone was very excited. As the camera wiggled a little, I heard a small voice say, "There, it's recording," before quieting down as a man came into view. He was clearly an adult, his head hidden unbelievably by a swoop of thin blonde hair, dressed in footy pajamas like a giant child. He had put on an approximation of a kid's voice, high and wavery, and skipped happily into the scene before landing with a whump on his butt amongst the presents. "Oh, goody, goody. Lots of presents for Pee-wee," he trumpeted. I couldn't help but cringe a little at what I was seeing. He sounded like someone doing a bad Tweety Bird impression, and he looked up at the camera with a gap-toothed grin as if he were making eye contact with me. It was highly unsettling, and I glanced away until I heard the ripping of paper and the happy gabble of the kid. It was pretty clear that he maybe wasn't all there, and I felt bad for being so uncomfortable as some parents recorded their kids' Christmas morning. It was cringy, but I didn't think there was any harm in it. He unwrapped a large stuffed dog, the fur looking incredibly soft even through the screen, and hugged it happily as he laughed. "Aw, thank you," he said, and that's when I heard something that made me hit rewind. I had to rewind 3 times before I figured out that it wasn't just a distortion, but once I heard it, it was impossible to unhear. It was clearly someone making a weird muffled sound out of camera range, and it sounded hurtful. It reminded me of someone crying out from another room, and I wished I could isolate it so I could be sure of the origin of the sound. The man-child, Billy, I guessed, was making so much noise over the stuffed dog that it was hard to tell, and when he grabbed up another present, I heard the sound again, followed by a muffled hushing sound. Something was off here, and it had me interested. It had never happened to me, but I had read some forum posts about people like me who had stumbled across odd, incriminating tapes. Sometimes it was CP or videos of murderers committing crimes, but the police usually paid money for these tapes. Sometimes certain collectors paid money for these tapes too. Either way, the date on the camera told me that the crime was long ago, if it was a crime at all. I slid a fresh VHS into the other side, the side that recorded, and hit the red button. I'd just make a little copy in case I had to turn this one over to the cops. Rent had to be paid, one way or another. On screen, the man-child had opened up a flashing police car, a large package of Hot Wheels, a few more plushies, and some books. He was ripping them open without any real joy, but seemed to revel in showing them to whoever was off-screen as he thanked them for their gifts. I watched as the books went into the fire, the hardbacks blackening as the fire took them. Off-screen, I could still hear the uncomfortable noises of whoever was on the other side, and someone was clearly crying. Someone else was trying to shush them, to console them, but it wasn't working. The man-child opened another gift and made a face as he discovered an expensive-looking package of makeup. Yuck! Who got me this girly stuff? He threw it against the wall, breaking the package and scattering the contents across the floor. He reached for another one, checking the label before throwing it against the wall, still wrapped. He shook the next one before breaking it against the fireplace, spilling colorful clothes from a garment box. He unwrapped another one, finding a ceramic clown, which also shattered against the fireplace. Clothes, makeup, jewelry, anything he didn't like seemed to find its way into the fire or against the wall, and soon the ground was littered with glass, metal, and bits of other things. The man-child was gleefully flying a toy plane around, surveying his mess, before tossing it against the fireplace too, and crawling off camera as he laughed. Someone screamed, the sound muffled, and he returned, dragging the girl with him by the ankle. She couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, and she was dressed in a nightgown that was now displaying an embarrassing amount of skin. She was bound and gagged, her hands tied cruelly behind her back, and as he loomed over her, I saw him take a knife from the floor beside the fireplace. It was a big one, almost a sword, and I could hear other muffled cries and screams from beyond the camera lens. He smiled as she wriggled, squirmed, and kicked, raising the knife high so she could see it. "Time to unwrap my will presents," he said, the voice making it all the more horrific. I suspected that I knew what he intended to do with this girl, but as I reached for the button, it appeared I was wrong. He plunged the knife down into her throat, the girl bucking and shaking as he sliced it down. It split her chest, sliding between her breasts as it slid across her stomach and into her nose. It slipped out of her wetness, and I could see red spreading over her nightgown. She was shaking in her death throes, and a woman could be seen dragging herself into view from off-screen. She was looking at the girl with teary eyes, trying to comfort her in the worst and last moments of her life, when the man struck again. The blade came down, and she shuddered as he stabbed her again and again. The blood flew up to spatter the walls, sizzling into the fire as the woman bucked and shook her life away. The girl in the bloody nightgown was dead, her mother not far behind, and as he freed the blade, he looked back at whoever was left and grinned gleefully. The presents hadn't mattered at all to him. This was his gift, his Christmas morning, and as he leapt out of sight, The sounds of stabbing and tussling could be heard. Muffled screams and pleas for help could be heard behind the scenes. They were silenced just as fast, but not before they were scared indelibly into my psyche. He spoke not a word, going straight to his work, and filled his victims with holes as the mother gave a final jerk. I sat there, frozen, watching it all unfold. I was powerless to turn it off now. I had to know, see, and understand why, but I would get no answers. I was as powerless as the people he was killing, and when he came back into view, I flinched in surprise. He was naked now, his body painted in blood, and he smiled at his handiwork before turning to grab the tree. Like the Grinch had in the old storybook, he stuffed it up the chimney. He didn't get it far, but I didn't believe he was trying to go up with it. It got stuck halfway up, and the dry limbs began to burn. The fire crept over them, and the broken garbage that had been the family's Christmas began to catch as well. As the house burned, he turned to the camera and winked luridly. "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Then he reached for the camera, and the video ended. I stood there staring at the static for a long time, almost expecting to see that bloody, crazed face reflected behind me on the screen of my television. After a while, I finally found the strength to grab my phone and call the police. They took the tape, thanking me for my diligence and saying that if it helped in the apprehension of a criminal, they would see that I got a reward. The other tape I burned in the barrel came back. I didn't even want to touch it, but I wanted it in my house even less. Now I'm sitting here watching the static, trying to figure out what to do. I have 5 more boxes of tapes to go through, but the thought of watching them terrifies me. Every time I reached for them, I remembered how he cut that girl open like Christmas paper and stabbed her mother to death while she was feet away. How many more tapes like that might be waiting for me? How many more Christmas mornings might be invaded by that ghoul in the footy pajamas? I don't know, but the more I think about it, the more I think it might be time to look for honest work.